The Boy Who Listened to Silence. In the soft hush of the 19th century, long before the world would know his name, a boy sat by the window of a small home in Freiburg, a quiet town nestled in the Moravian countryside. A candle beside him flickered, its flame ending in rhythm with his breath. Outside, snow whispered against the glass, and in that silence, young Sigmund Freud found his first companion, thought. He was not a child of noise or laughter, but of wonder, a listener to the invisible, an observer of the small moments that most others would let slip away. His mother, Amalia, called him Mein goldener Siggi, my golden Sigmund. She believed him destined for something beyond the ordinary. In the tender glow of her affection, Freud's mind bloomed early. He could read by the age of 8, devouring books with an appetite that startled his teachers. But it wasn't the words alone that drew him in. It was the silences between them. He would pause between sentences, stare into space, and let the story move through him like a quiet current beneath the skin. Even as a child, he seemed to sense that what people said was never quite the whole truth, that there was always something unspoken, lingering behind their eyes. His father, Jakob, was a man of reason, stern but gentle, practical but proud. When the world outside turned cold and uncertain, Jakob found comfort in faith and tradition. But young Freud's comfort came from questions. Why do people believe? Why do they dream? Why do they fear? While other children built toys or chased each other through the streets, he built worlds inside his head, vivid and mysterious, filled with faces and feelings he couldn't yet name. Their home was small, lined with the scent of candle wax and the faint hum of prayers. The family's Jewish heritage marked them as different in a world that often misunderstood difference. Yet Freud carried this quiet sense of otherness like a badge. It taught him early how to live both within and outside a world at once. He learned to observe people as if from a distance, to see not only what they did, but what they avoided saying. He began to feel that beneath every act and every smile, there was another story unfolding, silent, secret, and true. At night, when the lamps were dimmed and the house had fallen into the rhythm of sleep, he would lie awake, his mind buzzing with soft electricity. He watched the candle shadows dance across the ceiling, and in their shifting shapes, he imagined the great mysteries of being. What was the mind? What was this hidden space where dreams took place, strange, vivid, and uncontrollable? Even then, before he had the language of science or philosophy, he sensed that the human soul was not a single voice, but a chorus, one that sang even when we were silent. Years later, Freud would recall his childhood as a place of quiet beginnings, a cocoon woven from isolation and imagination. His mother's warmth, his father's restraint, his hunger for meaning, all of these would echo through his work, shaping the man he would become. But in that moment, he was just a boy beneath the dim Moravian sky, listening to the silence and finding comfort in the invisible. He did not yet know that this stillness, this fascination with what cannot be seen, would one day lead him into the deepest chambers of the human mind. For now, he only knew the sound of snow against glass, the slow heartbeat of thought, and the feeling of something vast and unnamed waiting patiently inside him. And so, as the night deepened and the candle melted into sleep. The Anatomy of Dreams. Years later, the boy from Freiburg walked beneath the amber lamps of Vienna, a city that glowed with intellect and contradiction. It was a place of music and melancholy, of gilded cafes and whispered gossip, of beauty built upon restraint. Here, Sigmund Freud became a student of the human body. But what fascinated him most was not flesh or bone, but the mystery that breathed within them. He studied medicine with the precision of a scientist and the sensitivity of a poet. The mind, he began to suspect, was not merely a set of thoughts. It was a landscape. And in that landscape, dreams were like rivers, winding, unpredictable, carrying fragments of what we feared, desired, and tried to forget. Freud would walk the cobblestone streets late at night, past the scent of roasted chestnuts and the sound of distant violins, wondering why certain dreams lingered in memory like half-heard confessions. To most of his peers, dreams were nonsense, static of the sleeping brain. But Freud felt otherwise. He began keeping notebooks by his bedside, scrawling notes the moment he woke. Broken images, fleeting faces, words that made no sense, yet somehow felt true. He started to see patterns, how each dream carried symbols, hidden meanings cloaked in the language of the subconscious. A stairway wasn't just a stairway. A key wasn't only a key. Each image was the disguise of a feeling too fragile to face in daylight. Vienna was his classroom, but his mind was the true laboratory. Every patient, every friend, every self-reflection became a clue. He watched how people laughed too loudly when anxious, how they spoke around pain instead of through it. Beneath every polite conversation, he sensed tension, like water pressing against glass, waiting to break. He began to suspect that the real world of the mind lay beneath consciousness, buried deep, like a hidden city beneath the streets of Vienna. His fascination soon turned obsession. He began experimenting with hypnosis, trying to reach that hidden layer. But hypnosis felt like a fragile door, one that opened easily, but never stayed open long enough. What he truly wanted was to understand the architecture of the mind, how memories, fears, and longings coexisted like ghosts under the surface of reason. At times, this pursuit isolated him. Colleagues dismissed his questions. Friends teased his intensity. But Freud's curiosity was relentless, not born of ambition, but of longing. He wanted to understand the human condition, to explain why we love, why we hurt, why we repeat what destroys us. Dreams, he wrote softly one night, are the royal road to the unconscious. He began to see the dream world as the mind's secret diary, a place where the truth could whisper safely, disguised as nonsense. Every image, every fragment of dialogue, every strange metamorphosis had a logic, but one written in a language older than speech itself. In his dim apartment, surrounded by candlelight and stacks of notes, he began decoding that language, patient by patient, night after night. And when he turned the key, when he saw the first glimpses of the unconscious, it was like standing at the edge of an ocean. Beneath the surface of everyday life, he saw endless tides of desire and memory, shifting and colliding, shaping every choice we make. He realized that humanity was not driven by reason alone, but by something far more ancient, something we fear, deny, and yet cannot escape. As the candles burned lower, Freud leaned back in his chair, his eyes heavy with fatigue, yet bright with discovery. Outside, Vienna slept, its citizens dreaming, unaware that in one small room, a man had just begun to map the unseen continent of the human soul. And so, as the night pressed closer, and his pen slowed to a halt, he looked once more at the page before him, filled with fragments of dreams, symbols, secrets, and whispered to himself, almost in awe, perhaps the mind never sleeps at all. The birth of psychoanalysis. In a dim, book-lined room on Berggasse 19, Vienna, the air often felt thick with whispers. The ticking of a clock marked the rhythm of thought itself. It was here that Freud's quiet revolution began, not with the shout of discovery, but with the soft murmur of conversation. The couch, covered in patterned fabric, became a kind of altar, not to gods or spirits, but to something far more intimate, the human voice. Freud had grown weary of treating symptoms that returned like ghosts. The trembling hands, the fainting spells, the inexplicable paralysis, all seemed to have no physical cause. He had seen hypnosis calm the mind for a moment, but never heal it. He wanted to go deeper, to find the hidden wound beneath the visible one. And so, he began to listen, not as a doctor commanding answers, but as a witness to pain. His patients, many of them women long dismissed by medicine as hysterical, began to speak freely. They told stories that had never been told before, of childhood memories, forbidden desires, guilt, shame, longing. Freud said little. He simply let them speak, guiding them softly when silence lingered too long. And what he discovered was astonishing. When the mind was allowed to speak without judgment, it began to untangle itself. Words, it seemed, had the power to set free what had been trapped. The process was slow, fragile, and deeply human. Sometimes tears came before understanding. Sometimes laughter followed sorrow. But always, beneath it all, Freud sensed the same truth. The mind carries its secrets like stones in deep water. To heal, one must bring them into light. He called this practice the talking cure. Through these long hours of listening, Freud began to see a pattern that every symptom, every strange behavior, a paralysis of the hand might conceal a memory the heart could not bear. A dream of falling might echo a fear of losing control. The unconscious, he realized, was not a dark pit of chaos, but a vast, structured place, a hidden library of everything the conscious mind had tried to forget. Freud's notes grew thicker, his theories clearer. He began to outline what he called free association, the act of speaking without censorship, letting thought flow unfiltered. The words that rose uninvited, he believed, were keys to the locked doors of the psyche. His patients became explorers, uncovering buried emotions they never knew existed. And Freud himself, the quiet boy who once listened to silence, had become the world's first cartographer of the inner world. Outside his office, the city was moving toward modernity. Electricity lit the streets. Trains roared through tunnels. The age of machines had begun. Yet inside this quiet room, Freud was unraveling a different kind of machinery. The invisible one inside every human being. He was beginning to prove that our minds are not governed only by will or logic, but by hidden forces, desires, fears, and memories that live just beneath awareness, shaping everything we are. He felt both exhilarated and afraid. If the mind was this deep, this layered, what did that say about human freedom? Were we truly the masters of ourselves, or merely the servants of hidden impulses? These thoughts haunted him as he wrote by candlelight, the ink trembling faintly with each stroke. In the quiet hours before dawn, when even the city's trams had fallen silent, Freud would sometimes sit by the window, watching the mist roll through the narrow streets. He would think of his patients, their tears, their confessions, their fragile courage, and feel a tenderness for the vast mystery of the human heart. The science he was building was not made of equations, but of stories. Stories whispered in confidence, stories that healed simply by being told. And when he closed his notebook each night, he felt it, the beginning of something larger than himself. Not a discovery, but a dawning realization that to speak one's truth, to uncover what lies hidden within, is to take the first step toward freedom. And so, the quiet hum of Berggasse 19 continued. Hour after hour, word after word, as a new kind of feeling was born. The birth of psychoanalysis was not a thunderclap. It was a whisper, a patient's breath, a pause between tears. And as the city slept beyond his window, Freud leaned back in his chair, listening once more to the silence that had followed him since childhood. The silence that now spoke volumes. The hidden self, There comes a moment in every seeker's life when the light they've kindled begins to reveal not just truth, but shadow. For Freud, that moment arrived quietly in the same small study where countless voices had already filled the air. His patience spoke, his pen moved, and piece by piece, he began to see something extraordinary. Beneath every action, every thought, every polite smile, there was another mind, deeper, older, wilder, shaping the self we believed we knew. He called it the unconscious. To Freud, it wasn't merely an idea, but an entire realm, vast and unseen, where forgotten memories, desires, and fears lived like restless spirits. It was not evil, nor good, but simply human, a mirror reflecting the secret stored inside us all. The conscious mind, he realized, was only a surface, the tip of an iceberg glinting in sunlight, while beneath it, he began to map this hidden country with words that would become immortal. The id, the ego, the superego. Three invisible forces, always at war, always entwined. The id was the child, impulsive and hungry, whispering of desire, anger, and need. The superego, stern and moral, stood guard like an ancient priest, reminding us of duty, guilt, and restraint. And between them balanced the ego, the fragile bridge of reason, trying endlessly to keep peace between chaos and conscience. For Freud, this was not theory alone. It was revelation. It explained why dreams trembled with secret longing, why slips of the tongue betrayed truth, why even in joy we carried unease. The mind, he realized, was not divided by weakness. It was designed that way. Our contradictions were not failures, but evidence of the beautiful complexity of being alive. He would sit for hours, lost in thought, staring into the glowing ember of his pipe, as if the smoke itself carried messages from that hidden world. He began to see his own reflection in his discoveries. The child who had once listened to silence, now listening to the silence within. The same patterns he found in others, he recognized in himself. He saw how ambition could disguise insecurity, how love could hide control, how morality could be shaped by the same instincts it tried to suppress. And yet, the more he understood, the lonelier his knowledge became. Few could follow him into this shadowed terrain. Many mocked the audacity of his claims, that every human being carried within them both saint and savage. But Freud did not flinch. He saw this duality not as darkness, but as truth. To him, understanding the hidden self was not about control. It was about compassion, for how could one truly forgive, love, or change without first facing what lived? In his later notes, he wrote, "The mind is not a single entity, but a conversation between our deepest impulses and the voices that try to silence them. A dance of yearning and restraint that plays endlessly beneath our awareness." To know oneself, he believed, was not to silence this conversation, but to listen. to hear the child within the adult, the fear within the confidence, the longing beneath the logic. Outside his study, the world of Vienna glittered with art and culture, but Freud saw beneath the gold. He saw the repression, the unspoken desires, the hunger for control that made civilization both beautiful and fragile. He began to realize that the same forces shaping the individual also shaped societies, that history itself was a reflection of the human psyche. Sometimes, after a long day, Freud would walk alone through the city's winter streets, the air cold against his face. The lamps flickered like thoughts, the fog curled around corners like dreams. He would glance at the strangers passing him, lovers, soldiers, shopkeepers, and feel a quiet awe. Each of them carried a universe inside, a hidden self full of contradictions and longing. And though they would never meet him, he understood them, not through their words, but through their silence. And when he returned home, the night deep and still, he would sit by his desk, his hand resting over his notes. The fire burned low, and in its faint orange light, Freud smiled, not in triumph, but in wonder. For he knew now that every human being was both a mystery and the key to that mystery. And so, as the night pressed close around him, he whispered into the quiet, as though speaking to the mind of the world itself. We are more than we appear to be, and perhaps that is our greatest secret. The women who spoke. In Freud's quiet Vienna office, where curtains softened the daylight and the air carried the faint scent of ink and pipe smoke, history was being rewritten, not in proclamations or grand discoveries, but in the trembling voices of women whom the world had refused to hear. They came in secret, wrapped in shame and confusion, speaking of pains that no doctor could diagnose, of feelings they dared not name. The world had called them hysterical. Freud, listening from his armchair, began to hear something far deeper. Each woman who sat before him became a mirror to humanity's hidden suffering. There was Anna, who could not feel her hand; Bertha, whose paralysis had no wound; Elizabeth, whose steps faltered though her legs were whole. Freud watched their expressions shift like passing weather, a nervous laugh, a sudden tear, a trembling pause before the truth. And through that fragile storm of confession, he brought meaning, that the body was speaking when words could not. He realized that pain, when buried, finds another way to live. A forgotten grief becomes a trembling limb. A secret desire hides behind fatigue. An unspoken trauma finds its voice in illness. The body, in its silence, tells the story the conscious mind refuses to hear. At first, his colleagues dismissed this notion. They mocked him for letting patients ramble, for wasting time on tales instead of treatments. But Freud saw something sacred in that rambling. When these women spoke freely, without interruption, without shame, something within them loosened. Their trembling eased, their tears softened, their breath deepened. Healing began not through medicine, but through understanding. He began to call this the talking cure, but to him It was more than a technique. It was an act of listening, of truly listening, not just to words, but to the spaces between them. Every pause was a clue. And as he listened, Freud began to sense the profound courage it took to speak truth in a world built to silence it. He never forgot that it was through these women, not theories or laboratories, that psychoanalysis found its first breath. They taught him that suffering could not be measured, that healing was not mechanical, that the mind was a living, feeling landscape. Their voices, once dismissed, became the foundation upon which the entire study of the unconscious would stand. Yet this realization came with sorrow, too. Freud saw how society's chains of morality, of gender, of expectation bound not only these women, but all people. Behind every polite smile, there was a hidden ache. Behind every act of obedience, a swallowed dream. The feminine suffering he witnessed was not just individual. It was symbolic of the repression within every human heart. Sometimes, late at night, when his office was empty and the echo of voices lingered, Freud would close his eyes and listen again to the ghosts of their words, to the echoes of stories half whispered, half wept. He knew that he was not only treating patients, he was listening to humanity itself. He began to believe that therapy was not simply about curing symptoms, but about freeing the soul, allowing it to reclaim the words it had once buried. Where speech begins, he wrote softly, symptom ends. It was not a slogan, but a truth he had witnessed over and over again, that the act of being heard, truly heard, could lift the heaviest sorrow from the heart. And so, behind the lace curtains of a modest Viennese room, the future of psychology was born, carried on the voices of women who refused to remain silent. They spoke, and the world began to change. When Freud finally closed his notebook and set his pen aside, he sat in the stillness for a long moment. He sat in the stillness for a long moment. Humboldt, the revolution he had sparked, was not his alone. It belonged to those who had trusted him with their pain, to those whose stories had become the map of the mind itself. And as he looked toward the dim window, the street beyond bathed in gaslight, he whispered to the quiet night, as if in gratitude. They spoke, and I listened, and in their voices, humanity learned to listen to itself. The storm of rejection. The human mind is not the only thing that resists being uncovered. The world, too, recoils when someone dares to look too deeply. For Freud, that truth arrived like a slow and gathering storm. Not sudden, not loud at first, but inevitable. His ideas, once whispered in small circles, began to spread through Vienna like wildfire. And with that spread came disbelief, scorn, and the sharp chill of rejection. He had imagined that truth, once revealed, would be embraced. Instead, he found himself alone at the center of a tempest. The physicians and scholars he once admired now called him a fantasist, a corrupter of morality, a man too obsessed with sex and dreams to be taken seriously. Even some of his closest colleagues, the ones who had sat in his parlor, listening to his theories with fascination, began to turn away. Their silence stung more than their criticism. Freud felt it deeply. the quiet loneliness of being right too soon. Yet the rejection did not silence him. If anything, it deepened his resolve. He began to see the resistance itself as proof that the very instincts and defenses he wrote about were alive in those who dismissed him. Civilization, he realized, had built its comfort on repression, on the polite denial of everything wild and uncomfortable within. And now, he was pulling back the curtain. Of course, they would turn on him. To question Freud was to defend oneself. Still, there were nights when doubt crept in like fog through the window. He would sit by the dim lamplight, surrounded by pages covered in his looping script, and wonder if he had gone too far. Was he uncovering truth or inventing it? Could the human mind truly bear to know itself so completely? And yet, whenever he considered turning back, another letter would arrive. A note from a student in Paris or a doctor in Zurich. Someone who had read his work and felt seen, understood, awakened. Those small voices of support became his lanterns in the storm. Vienna, with its glittering salons and rigid hierarchies, had no place for a man who spoke so openly about desire, repression, and fear. His ideas were too intimate, too unsettling. To admit he was right, you'd be to admit that the veneer of respectability was paper thin. So they mocked him. They called him dangerous, immoral. But Freud knew better. He knew that to face the truth of one's inner world was not corruption. It was courage. His home became his fortress. Jealousy, ambition, the hunger for recognition. And so Freud watched it all, the admiration and the betrayal, the applause and the laughter with a strange calm. He no longer sought universal approval. The truth he had found was not meant to comfort. It was meant to awaken. And awakening, he knew, was never gentle. On certain evenings, when his lectures drew only a few faithful listeners, Freud would walk home through the empty Viennese streets, his breath fogging in the lamplight. He would pass by the great statues and buildings, their stone faces cold and eternal, and feel a quiet pride. For while the world clung to appearances, he was devoted to what lay beneath, to the trembling, honest heart of the human soul. He had lost friends, fame, and peace, but he had gained something rarer, conviction. In one of his notebooks from this time, he wrote, "Opposition is not an obstacle to truth. It is the proof of its necessity." And so, he endured the storm, not as a victim, but as a witness. He let the winds of criticism howl and the waves of mockery crash. And when morning came, he was still there, still writing, still listening. The silence that followed the storm was the same one he had known since childhood, deep, patient, and full of meaning. As dawn crept across the Viennese skyline, Freud closed his window. The city below, still wet from rain. He touched his pen to the page one last time that night and whispered to himself, not in bitterness, but in quiet faith, "They will understand one day, not because of me, but because they must." And so, as the world turned its gaze away, Freud continued inward, into the next chapter of his life, and deeper still, into the unseen realms of the human mind, the fragile mind of civilization. The years passed, and the storm began to calm, not because the world had accepted Freud, but because it had grown weary of fighting him. His ideas, once dismissed as scandalous, had taken root in the shadows. They whispered through classrooms, echoed in clinics, and lingered in the minds of poets and philosophers who found in his work a mirror of their own restlessness. Freud had become something larger than a man. He was a disturbance, a question that refused to die. Yet even as his theories spread, the world outside was trembling. Europe stood at the edge of transformation. Art was breaking from tradition, politics from monarchy, and morality from the illusion of order. The old world was cracking, and through those cracks seeped the unconscious of an entire civilization. Freud saw it everywhere, in the rise of violence, in the hunger for control, in the strange contradictions of progress. Humanity, he believed, was advancing outward while collapsing inward. He began to ask a question that haunted him for the rest of his life. If a man represses his instincts and desires, what happens when an entire society does the same? In his later writings, Civilization and Its Discontents, most notably, Freud turned his gaze from the patient on the couch to the entire human race. He imagined civilization itself as a patient, brilliant, ambitious, and deeply neurotic. Humanity had tamed nature, built cities, created art and law, but in doing so, it had caged. Civilization was not healing. It was projecting. The same defense mechanisms he observed in his patients, denial, displacement, repression, were now playing out on a global scale. Humanity was at war with its own unconscious. To most, these were dark thoughts, but Freud saw them as clarity, a painful, necessary awakening. He was not condemning civilization. He was diagnosing it. The human drive for love, for peace, for creation, these were real, but so too were the instincts for destruction, envy, and death. The balance between the two was what he called the eternal struggle of Eros and Thanatos, life and death, love and ruin, locked forever in silent combat within the human heart. And yet, amid all his grim insights, Freud still found moments of tenderness. He saw hope in the patient who dared to speak honestly, in the artist who gave shape to fear, in the small child who dreamed freely before society taught him shame. For all his skepticism, Freud never stopped believing in the possibility of understanding, that by facing the truth within, humanity might learn to live with itself. But time was not kind to him. The world he had tried to explain grew darker. The rise of fascism, the hatred that swept across Europe, and the horrors that followed, all seemed to confirm his warnings. In his final years, as illness ate away at his strength, Freud watched from exile as his beloved Vienna, the city of his life's work, fell to forces he had long predicted: fear, repression, and the desperate longing for authority. Civilization, he thought, had finally given in to its neuroses, Still, he wrote. Even in pain, he dictated his final thoughts about art, love, death, and the strange endurance of the human soul. He no longer sought to cure humanity. He only wished for it to see itself clearly, even for a moment. Because in that moment of truth, however brief, lay freedom. When Freud died in 1939, the world was once again at war. Yet his ideas, once rejected and ridiculed, endured, quietly shaping philosophy, literature, and psychology itself. The man who had been mocked for speaking of dreams had, in the end, changed the way the world saw its own mind. He left behind not a perfect science, but a mirror, one that still waits for each generation to look into it and ask, who are we beneath the masks we wear? And in that question, whispered in therapy rooms, classrooms, and sleepless nights, Freud lives on. His voice, calm and unrelenting, still invites us inward. The mind is like an iceberg. What we see is small. What lies beneath, that is where we truly are. The legacy of Freud is not comfort. It is confrontation, a reminder that civilization, for all its brilliance, remains fragile because it is human. Beneath its polished surface, the unconscious stirs, dreaming, remembering, yearning to be known. A legacy of dreams. Night has always belonged to the dreamers, to those who wander the quiet corridors of their own mind when the world grows still. For Freud, the night was both a mystery and a map. Long before he became the father of psychoanalysis, he was a young man who dreamt of success, of love, of understanding the secret patterns that danced behind human thought. And as his years unfolded, he came to believe that dreams were not random illusions, but the hidden language of the soul. He called them the royal road to the unconscious. In those fragile hours before dawn, when reason loosens its grip and imagination drifts freely, Freud believed we meet our truest selves. Every image, every strange symbol, every fleeting fear, it was all meaning disguised as mystery. The dream, he said, is a wish, often one we dare not speak aloud. Beneath its surreal surface lies the truth we hide from daylight in the soft darkness of his study. Surrounded by statues of ancient gods and the gentle ticking of a clock, Freud wrote of these nightly visions with reverence. He did not see dreams as puzzles to be solved, but as poetry written by the unconscious, messages sent from the depths, asking only to be understood. He studied them not with cold analysis, but with curiosity, almost tenderness. He saw in them humanity's forgotten honesty. To dream, for Freud, was to return to innocence, to a time before repression, before the layers of guilt and duty that adulthood demands. He believed that every child's imagination was a doorway to the purest truth of the mind. And though his theories evolved, that childlike wonder never left him. Even in old age, as his body weakened, he still marveled at the simple miracle that the mind could create entire worlds while the body slept. But perhaps what Freud never fully said what lived only in his silences was that he, too, possibly was dead. Wait. Dreamed for understanding. He dreamed of a world where people could speak freely, love without shame, and live without fear of their own thoughts. A world that would no longer divide the self between what it feels and what it's allowed to express. His theories were not simply about pathology. They were a kind of compassion, a way of saying, your darkness is not your enemy, it is your reflection. And though decades have passed since his final breath, the legacy of Freud remains not in the precision of his science, but in the humanity of his vision. The therapist's couch, the gentle invitation to speak, the courage to confront one's own truth, all of it traces back to that man who dared to believe that healing begins not with medicine, but with honesty. Every time someone closes their eyes and drifts into a dream, Freud's spirit stirs. Every time a person speaks what they've long held inside, beneath every thought, every action, there is a hidden story. And that story deserves to be heard. The dream, after all, is not just a whisper from the unconscious. It is a bridge between who we are and who we long to be. Freud believed that by listening to our dreams, we begin to reunite the divided parts of ourselves. That is his gift to humanity. Not certainty, but awareness. Not peace, but the courage to seek it. As the story of his life fades into the soft glow of memory, one truth remains. Freud did not simply study the human mind. He held up a lantern to its darkest corners and invited us to look within. He taught us that even in confusion, even in fear, there is beauty, because to search within is to be alive. And perhaps that is where his true legacy rests, not in the books or theories, but in the quiet courage of self-discovery, in the willingness to face one's own reflection and whisper, I want to understand. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, imagine Freud's lantern still glowing somewhere in the deep, warm, steady, and patient. Let it guide you through your own dreams, through the shifting shapes of memory and emotion. For in the end, the world he revealed was not frightening at all. It was simply human. And as the final light fades, remember his most timeless message. Out of your vulnerabilities will come your strength. If these words carry you closer to sleep, let this story and this channel stay by your side too, for the night is long and the mind eternal.